I would like to share a very incredible story with you. Now, this is a tale of an immigrant from Switzerland who was a watchmaker. Now, he and his family immigrated to the United States from Switzerland following the Napoleonic Wars. And this individual would be connected with 4 American presidents, and indeed, he would be even recognized later fundamentally as the father of American watchmaking. And this is quite fascinating. But today I'd like to discuss the individual Julien Montandon. Now, Julien and his family, just a bit of a backstory. They decided to immigrate to the United States from Le Brenay in Switzerland. And this is in the canton of Neuchâtel. And we do find their immigration was not without problems. Now, this is recorded in the papers of Thomas Jefferson, the 3rd president of the United States. Now, Jefferson had been in search of a watchmaker for his local community. And one of his friends, Patterson, was working on this solution to try to find specifically a watchmaker who could locate to his area. Now, Patterson worked mainly with Ferdinand Hassler. Now, Hassler, he is a very interesting character. Now, Ferdinand Hassler, this was an individual who also has Swiss origins. He had immigrated approximately almost a decade before Julien and his family. But it was through these dealings that we find that the family of Pierre-Henri Montandon was suggested for this post. Now, the family immigrated around 1814, 1815 period, and when they did so, they were arrested by the British Navy, and they were put in prison in London as suspected spies. Now, obviously, following the Napoleonic Wars, we have a situation where these French-speaking individuals are suspected French. However, they were Swiss citizens, and this apparently was eventually resolved. They were able to immigrate to the U.S., and they located themselves in Elizabethtown, New Jersey. And it is interesting in the time before they immigrated, we do find records of Julien having a passport, and this is recorded in a book by Maurice Ivard, and we find that he had passport, this was passport number 79, and we do find him what appears to be conducting earlier reconnaissance to the French western seaboard. We find him with stamps for France and Holland in 1807 and 1810, later for Bordeaux in 1812. And we also eventually have the travel document stamped February 2nd, 1815, Bordeaux, Amérique. So it does appear that by 1815, this is early 1815. This is when they started their immigration. And he immigrated with the entire family. Now, they had one of the sons of Pierre-Henri had died in his youth at the age of 24. That was Charles Henry. But the other family members, including Pierre-Henri's wife and 7 children, all immigrated. And they immigrated with a son-in-law as well, and this was Louis Lechaud. This is the husband of Sophie Montandon. Now, Louis-Aimé Lechaud is the individual on whom Thomas Jefferson settled, or more or less, Pierre-Henri had refused this position. He was already advanced in age. He remained in the Elizabethtown area. However, the son-in-law, Louis Lechaud, and Sophie took up this position in the Jefferson, at the request of Thomas Jefferson, and we see by these letters in the Jefferson papers that they are quite very well received. In fact, basically considered as family members in the Jefferson household. And it is to be noted that upon the death of this watchmaker, Louis Lechaud, and his wife subsequently, these are the only individual in the Jefferson family plot, the cemetery at Monticello, the plantation. And this shows that even after the death of Thomas Jefferson, Louis Lechaud died several years later, that he was allowed to be buried at this place because he was essentially considered part of the family. And this was made quite clear in the letters, and they shared meals together. But later, many decades later, Sophie, when she died in 1853, her body was taken from Iowa and reinterred at the Jefferson plantation at Monticello. And this is something to the level of closeness that they shared. But almost certainly, our Julien would have had some connection with Thomas Jefferson. It is clear that the families were very close, and any visitor that would travel from distance would have been received, and this would have been a very big event, and clearly this would have been a time where Jefferson would have been introduced. Clearly Jefferson was very keen on inventions and watch technology, and Julien, we'll find, was not only a watchmaker, but an inventor. This is quite fascinating. This is very in line with Thomas Jefferson's own interests. So let us move beyond this. So this is a suspected connection, it must be said, with Thomas Jefferson, the first of these four individuals, the presidents of the United States with whom Julien had this connection. But it is interesting. Now, we do want to approach this assignation that he was given. Now, we do know of this very famous individual, W.H. Keith, who wrote a very singular watch history book, A Family Tale, or The History of American Watchmaking, in 5 chapters. And this was published in 1883. So this was more than 30 years after Julien's death, but he notes the discovery of several watches signed Julien Montandon, New York. And some of these have patent numbers in them, but clearly these were from the around 1830 period. And Julien most likely removed. He was in the New York area, right across from New York and New Jersey in Elizabethtown. However, he seems to have relocated certainly before 1830 to Washington, D.C. It's not exactly clear after he located to Washington, was he still signing watches Julien Montandon, New York? This is a possibility, but not exactly clear. However, this interesting notation by Keith is very telling. He states in his book, I have also a watch made in New York City which antedates the Roxbury watch by some 15 years. It is number 40 and made by Montandon of the Hautefeuille patent lever type, rack and pinion, that also omits the fusee and chain and is similar in appearance to the Roxbury watch, in which there are, by a count as before, just 79 pieces. So the so-called father of American watchmaking was preceded in a very important feature of his watch by a workman of his own country. And here he is referring to Julien Montandon, with whom he originally noted that he was making this watch with patent number 24, described by an owner, which was Dr. Green of Worcester, probably made around 1835. This was the last known effort at American watchmaking until the company in Roxbury commenced watchmaking 12 or 15 years after Montandon and 30 after the Goddards. So this is more or less stating that the father of American watchmaking is the one and the same Julien Montandon. So this is very high praise, but let us analyze the interaction that he had with various presidents and governmental institutions after he located to Washington, D.C. I think you'll find it quite fascinating. Just a small break in our story. I'd like to make a shout out to one of my subscribers who I believe is a descendant of the sister of Julien Montandon. And this was, I believe, Louise Marie or Louise Marianne, who married a Mr. Vincent. I believe his name was Charles Vincent, who was also from Switzerland. But this is just a shout out to somebody who has followed this channel and is part of the story in a way. Now, once in Washington, D.C., and this was likely at the end of the 1820s, certainly 1827 perhaps, we do find Julien's first presidential contact is with the sixth president of the United States, John Quincy Adams. And Adams kept a very meticulous diary recording his daily appointments, affairs, meetings, and this type of thing. Now, these writings are extensive. They cover over 15,000 pages of material. And Julien Montandon is a very prevalent factor in these years of 1827 and 1828, etc. The Adams papers describe his various meetings where Julien was in the White House, in the Oval Office, demonstrating his ingenious instruments, as by his own description, the president's, and this included metallic thermometer watches with 3 indicator needles, various different sundials, parallelograms, meridian line finders, and this type of thing. All kinds of, clearly they were having discussions, very philosophical discussions on the art of the science of watchmaking and time. And this is really fascinating. In one instance, we find John Quincy Adams, Mr. Montandon brought with him a metallic thermometer in the form of a watch with 3 fingers on 3 different axes, showing not only the present temperature at any given time, but the maximum and minimum of heat within 24 hours. A very ingenious instrument, the main objection to which is that it is of too delicate construction to be constantly exposed to the open atmosphere, and yet can otherwise be of a little use. Now, he had also my small portable brass sundial, but said it could not show the time accurately. It was an ouvrage de pacotille, but he had not fully discovered the principle of its construction, notes the president, etc., etc. There are many different entries where Mr. Montandon is listed in these diaries, and we can deduce that these are all relating to Julien Montandon, who had a watch shop on Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C. And apparently he had been working on various personal clocks of the president's, including a Penelope clock, his own chronometer, pocket chronometer, which he fixed, cleaned, and etc. Various different, a lot of these have to do with repair. Now, we also find that he was working with other government organizations under the president, and this is very, very interesting. So I would like to discuss the departments with which Julien was engaged and the individuals with whom he worked. However, let us first return to John Quincy Adams. Now, we have a July 21st, 1828 entry. Mr. Montandon was here with a timepiece of his invention made for the Ordnance Department. and indicating hours, minutes, seconds, and thirds or 60ths part of a second. He asked me what he should call it and said he had thought of naming it a velisometer. I said that would be a very compounded, that would be a word compounded from two different languages, velox being Latin and metron Greek. If he meant to give it a name as a measure of speed, he should call it a tachometer. And he continues with the etymology. This is interesting that they have this relationship, the president and Julien, that Julien is asking what he should call his own invention. And this is a form of flattery, which I find fascinating. And he uses this opportunity to inquire from the president what he believes it should be called. So this is interesting, but we later we will find that this more than likely this was a micrometer of something of this variety, that this was called the so-called micronometer. So this would be an object that would be used in many of the experiments and observations and scientific data recording that he was participating with the government. And these watches would be sold to the U.S. government, to various departments, in addition to metallic thermometers, which were also sold to the government. And these were probably both in watch form, but certainly almost a metallic bar, that it was exactly this idea that these were items that could be exposed to the elements, which was the first criticism that John Quincy Adams had given, that they were too delicate. So he had resolved this problem by making a much more robust version. And this was used up until during the Civil War, 1860 period. It is noticed in the Navy's in documentation from the U.S. Navy and the Coast Guard. So quite fascinating. Now, we do find his contact with other U.S. presidents. Now, there is a Library of Congress document, which is a receipt, a note from Andrew Jackson, the 7th President of the United States. Now, he followed John Quincy Adams. And this was the President of the U.S. to, now they have recorded it as T. Montandon. This is clearly a 19th century J Montandon, Julien Montandon. And it's interesting that in the top right corner is a title, Doctor, for repairing and cleaning a gold watch, and for $2, Washington City, etc. And it is received, signed J. Montandon. So, which is clearly not a T. And we also see the other letters in the signature of the president that indicates this is clearly a J. So, very fascinating that he was still servicing the president's watches. And it appears almost as an unofficial watchmaker to the presidents at this point, when we have more than two, and clearly he was on familiar terms with Thomas Jefferson. So the last president we can see he had some interaction with was Martin Van Buren, and this was not directly with Van Buren, but through his son, where we see this paperwork signed, the United States President's House. And back in the day, the White House was called the President's House, and Washington, D.C. was called President's City. But this was in 1837. This is already 10 years after he had began to work with John Quincy Adams. But this was for repair and cleaning of 2 clocks to J. Montandon, Doctor. So once again, we find this doctor terminology, and this is not exactly clear when and where he got this degree. It is highly possible that this was through the Franklin Institute. This is a very interesting appellation. It is not exactly clear where this degree, but clearly he was doing, as we will find out, very technically involved scientific experimentation for the U.S. government, a burgeoning U.S. military, This is the Navy. This is the Department of the Ordnance or the Artillery, and this is also at the Naval Observatory and the Survey of the Coast, what would later become the Coast Guard. Now, we also know that he did work in the U.S. Senate for regulating clocks, repairing regulating clocks. He worked in the U.S. Office of Indian Affairs under miscellaneous expenses for putting together and starting a clock and for mending and repairing a clock. And then we also know that the U.S. War Department, that as early as 1830, they were purchasing his thermometers. The thermometer coil, like that of Breguet, only of much stouter material and of two metals, silver and platinum, soldered together, and a plan of registering that resembles that adopted by Jurgensen of Copenhagen and by Montandon of Washington in their metallic thermometers. We find this in the National Museum of American History documentation. So, but this is very, very interesting. We see the level of this collaboration with the U.S. government. And these generally we find these were seem to be in use up until at least 1860, and we find these listed as self-regulating thermometers and priced $40 by the naval establishment in their expense ledgers. But let us go on to discuss, and now these thermometers, it must be noted, were also used for meteorological, that is weather recording, and in medical recording, as we find Montandon's thermometer is mentioned on February 12th, 1834, in an edition of the Boston Medical and Surgical Journal, predecessor of the New England Journal of Medicine, where this is noted. Now, it may have been that this was specifically associated for meteorology. However, it is interesting that rather than medicine, but it is interesting that it is noted here. Now, his scientific work, this was such experiments as the depth of the sea experiments, and once again, this Patterson, who was a friend of Thomas Jefferson, appears to be reading a paper by a Professor Bonnycastle of the University of Virginia, and notes from an experiment from 1838 on determining the depth of the sea by the echo, and now this was used. This experiment was utilizing this so-called. This is the same device that he had invented, which was here it is called a very sensible instrument for measuring small intervals of time, made by J. Montandon of Washington, and which was capable of indicating the 60th part of a second. So this has to be this tachometer, of which he had spoken to and demonstrated in the Oval Office to the president a decade prior. This would have been then research that was carried on by a Captain Gedney, and this is Thomas R. Gedney of the Survey of the Coast. And now it's interesting, Ferdinand Hassler, he was the first superintendent of the Survey of the Coast. Later he became superintendent of weights and measures. But he seems to have been, Julien seems to have been acquainted with all of these individuals. And now Gedney himself was quite fascinating in that he saved the life of Andrew Jackson, the president, in was it 1839, I believe. But he was also an individual who was involved in the Amistad case, which later you'll recall the movie about the Amistad. And his part in that wasn't exactly noble, but clearly this was an interesting character, an establishment character in Washington, D.C. And in the same Survey of the Coast, we have the Rear Admiral Charles Wilkes, who had reported Gedney. He probably had some interaction with him by the all looks and appearances. Now, that Wilkes in himself was an interesting character. Now, he was raised by Elizabeth Ann Seton, who would become a Catholic saint. This is, once again, a very, very fascinating story, backstory here. But amongst the other officers which he worked with, now, he worked with a Colonel Roberdo, and this is Lieutenant Colonel Isaac Roberdo of the Topographical Engineers. He was the chief of the Topographical Bureau, Department of War. And we find Quincy Adams mentioning that Julien is working with him on various projects. Now, later we will see that Lieutenant James Melville Gillis of the Depot of Charts and Instruments. Now, this would be basically for magnetic and meteorological research at the astronomical naval observatory, where they undertook astronomical observations. And here we find references to Julien controlling the level of mercury in various different scientific equipment to get more accurate readings, and taking various different readings. And most likely he was timing with his super accurate watch that he had developed, and which was very sensation in the Washington, D.C. Establishment. But in addition to the Naval Observatory magnetic and meteorological observations, we find him involved in other research with the Ordnance Office, and this was with Captain Alfred Mordecai at the Washington Arsenal. And this was experiments with gunpowder and experiments with an 8-inch mortar. And this was the timing of artillery fire. Now, his watch was very good for reading the movement of flowing water in streams, and for calculating the time of the flight of projectiles for applications in artillery. So, very interesting. Once again, we see the level of, clearly through all these experiments, as a result of this, it's very possible to surmise that this doctor title was as a result of all of this collaboration with these burgeoning departments of the U.S. military and the government. But we are given really interesting insights when one views these projects that were ongoing. But we see a lot of references to Julien's inventions. The thermometer, we see it mentioned in the Granite Monthly, records this as a device which was used, and we also see the micronometer mentioned in various different articles, such as Washington newspapers, and also the Argus of Savannah, Georgia, records this. They're quoting the National Intelligencer. In a matter of fact, one article refers to him, specifically to his arrival in the city and his instrument. I quote, "We have seen a curious timepiece made for one of the departments by Mr. Montandon, an ingenious artist who has recently taken a residence in the city. The instrument is called a micronometer, being a measure of time in a very minute portions. It indicates with great accuracy and distinctness portions of time so small as the 1/60th part of a second, and these small divisions are measured with as much ease and accuracy as seconds or minutes are measured by the ordinary timekeepers." The instrument is designed for determining the time of flight of projectiles, the velocity of running streams, and for astronomical observations. We are informed that instruments for these purposes have heretofore been imported from Europe, and which, although purporting to measure time in very small portions, were no better than ordinary pocket watches. The ingenious artist who has so successfully accomplished this difficult undertaking, we hope may receive the patronage which his skillfulness merits. And this is in the National Intelligencer article. This was already 1828 in this time frame, so it does appear that probably, certainly by 1828, beginning of 1828, he had already been in situ in Washington City. But this gives a lot of very pertinent information about his own technical sophistication as a watchmaker and inventor. And we do know that there's a very famous Swiss watch inventor, indeed watch tools and this variety, and this individual appears to have been living at the Montandon home before they immigrated, so these young individuals would have probably had very fascinating philosophical and technological evenings where they were discussing this technology and finding solutions for improving their arts in the measurement of time. This is very thrilling backstory to their leaving Switzerland. But many of the things that we find with regards to the astronomical observations, and this went on 1838, 1839, we find many entries where it is Julien who is examining the clock, altering the pendulum. On May 27th, took 1/10 of an inch of mercury out of the pendulum cistern at the request of Mr. Montandon. So very precise altercations. July 30th, 1839, Mr. Montandon altered the weight by suspending it outside of the case and increasing it, etc. So this gives us a lot of detail on they were observing transits of heavenly bodies and measuring the time. Once again, this is all very important with regards to navigation. It must be remembered the technology of this time and how they were navigating. So we do have a very good picture of this watchmaker who, sadly, time has forgotten, yet his contributions are significant. And it is a sort of lost chapter of early American history, specifically when this burgeoning nation was rising slowly from its condition at the time. It was a third world backwater at this time, fundamentally, but we do find it is with the skillfulness of such inventors and talented people as this Julien who really advanced the country to the position that we know it today, that we have these young immigrants that have really done wonders. We let us return to the death of Julien. Now, this was in 1851, and he is found in the 1843 Washington City Directory. We find him listed on the north side of Pennsylvania Avenue between the 12th and 13th Streets, closer to the 13th Streets, but not at the corner. And prior to his death, now he seems to have been working from this shop, and this is described as a one-story shop. However, at the time of his death, it appears that he was resident at some part in the back of the shop. But we do find before his death, in the years before his death, that he appears to be turning this over to a successor to run the business. And this was in A.C. Huguenin and Co. And we find articles in the press devoted to explaining to his customers how this A.C. Huguenin is a very talented Swiss watchmaker, etc. But it will be noted that J. Montandon's watch and jewelry shop is still mentioned around 1902 in Washington, D.C. on Pennsylvania Avenue, suggesting that the business had still retained its name even a half century after the watchmaker's death. And this is rather interesting, but it is these small clues give us a window into finding the watch shop specific location. Now, these buildings have been demolished today. However, there are old postcards. We can find the location on the map, but we do have an old postcard which gives a very approximate location, and there may be photographic evidence of such. We're told later that this would eventually become a hat shop, and this was around 1892. So this 1902 mention is not exactly clear. Perhaps there was a little moving that whoever was running J. Montandon's watch shop moved it to a slightly bigger premises at this time. But I would like to close on an article which we find, which this is in 1892, and this specifically mentions that this was with regard to the old stories from the Washington racetrack. And this individual was recalling an old story about this very fast horse, the fastest ever, and he describes how it was timed. And he mentions that the watch that this Mr. Galt used was made by a Mr. Montandon, who had a watch shop between 12th and 13th Street. And he gives the description, brings us exactly back to Julien. And it is just fascinating to see that they speak about how precise the watch is. And once again, I think we're seeing in motion regaling of this fantastic item which he showed to the president way back in 1828. So this is very intriguing, but the fact that he is remembered even 40 years after his death, and probably 50 years after the event, tells of these horological and scientific achievements in this most interesting saga. So I hope this has been interesting. I know it's been long, but I appreciate your interest. And if you have any questions, please drop a line. Thank you. Bye-bye.